what we're looking at is whether or not there should be a crime of ecocide, either at international level or domestic level, or possibly both. As I think probably all of you are aware, very recently there was a proposal that there should be an international crime of ecocide with a specific definition that's attached to it that you can see in this slide. What we're looking at today, Claire and I, is not whether this specific definition should be adopted. We're more interested in the looking at it at a conceptual level, thinking of ecocide as basically large-scale destruction of the environment. The question is, should there be a crime, either at international law, domestic, or both, to deal with that? And then, if the answer to that is yes, obviously you'd have to look at what should the definition of the crime be before you could take things further. We're not looking at the definition today, as I said. We're looking at just whether there should be a crime at all to deal with this particular issue. Now, many individuals and organisations have proposed that there should be, particularly at international level, but so far, as some of you all know, that there isn't such a crime at international level, although there are some jurisdictions that actually do have crimes of ecocide, although they might not use the actual term ecocide. Now, there isn't actually any consensus here as to what the best approach is for the future. There isn't even consensus amongst environmental campaigners. And of course, there are many people who would be opposed to what they regard as yet more unnecessary environmental regulation, who would oppose any attempt to introduce a crime of ecocide. And in terms of people who are in favour of introducing a crime of ecocide, there are some who say it should be addressed at international level. There are some who say it should be addressed at national level. I think probably the majority who are in favour of such a crime actually think it should be at both domestic and international level. And there are some people who say the focus should be on starting with international law, and then hopefully states would follow in compliance with international law. And there are some people who say, well, maybe you should start at domestic level, and countries might set an example that could inspire other countries to introduce similar legislation, and then international law could change as a result of that. Now, in terms of opposition to the introduction of a crime of ecocide, there are the usual arguments I think you'll be familiar with, that the main one I would imagine would be the potential or perceived potential economic impact of introducing such a crime. And there's also the usual concern when you look at international law about international law arguably undesirably interfering with domestic autonomy. So we'll look briefly at those issues. Now, in terms of the way we're structuring this presentation, I'll look at the issue in relation to international law, international criminal law, and then Claire will take over and look at the issue in relation to domestic or national legislation. And what I'm doing in terms of international laws, looking at the pros and cons of, or potential pros and cons of introducing a new crime of ecocide. So, as you can see, there are other people have already proposed that there should be an international crime of ecocide. And the Stop Ecocide Foundation wasn't the first organisation to propose that, but they very recently came up with a very specific definition of ecocide that they're saying should be enshrined in international law and should be added as a new crime and the International Criminal Court should be given jurisdiction to deal with that issue. Now, in terms of potential benefits here, there's been a number of proposed benefits. One is, as you can see, that it might deter companies from damaging the environment. So deterrence is the first, I think, the most obvious potential benefit of making ecocide a crime. So the argument here is that if you make the decision makers in companies potentially liable for damaging the environment, then they're much less likely to do it, because they, particularly if they think they might be brought up before a criminal court that's known for dealing with international war criminals, they don't want to be hauled before courts and given the label of some sort of international criminal. So that's the theory, and obviously criminal law, people say, is there to deter. And in terms of evidence as to whether international criminal law does actually deter, and whether environmental law in particular deters companies and individuals, there is some evidence that suggests, firstly, that international criminal law and the International Criminal Court in particular has had a deterrent effect. There is a study that's been done that shows that, to my surprise to an extent, that countries that have agreed to be governed by the International Criminal Court, so fall within its jurisdiction, have actually improved their human rights records as a result. What I was expecting before I started looking into this area was that the countries that are most in compliance with human rights already would be the countries that are most likely to agree to be governed by the International Criminal Court, and that largely their behaviour wouldn't be changed as a result of being governed in that way. But there is some evidence that shows that they actually, that countries actually do change their records in terms of human rights once they agree to be bound by the International Criminal Court. And as far as environmental law and whether that does actually have a deterrent effect, that again, there are some studies that suggest that it does. Obviously, it doesn't stop all, say, pollution. If you pass a law against it, it's not going to stop all of it. But there are studies that show, particularly in America, that companies have changed in response to environmental legislation, not necessarily because they genuinely believe in protecting the environment, but arguably simply for their reasons of self-interest. They're concerned about being prosecuted, and the people running the companies are also concerned about being prosecuted. So there is some evidence that shows that there could be a deterrence effect through creating a crime of ecocide, and that's an argument for creating it at international level. Now, a second point that's been argued in relation to the benefits of a crime of ecocide at international level is that it could encourage healthy innovation and investment in green technology. So because companies might be deterred from investing in polluting and environmentally damaging behaviour, they're not going to simply stop trying to make money, and what they'll do instead, the argument goes, is investing in sort of green technology. Now, as far as the evidence goes in relation to that, as to what companies actually do in reality, there is, again, some studies show that that is actually, to an extent, what happens, that car manufacturers, for example, can be encouraged through the use of legislation to design cars in a more environmentally friendly manner. So you can use legislation to an extent, at least, to encourage development in the right direction. Now, A third argument, as you can see from this slide, is that creating a crime of ecocide at international level can somehow shore up and strengthen environmental law in general. I'm not sure exactly what the argument is here, but it could be that by creating an extremely serious crime, you emphasize how important it is to protect the environment, and then people take all the environmental laws that arguably are less serious more seriously. So by showing how important it is to protect the environment through creation of a new offence, you could arguably get people to pay more respect to laws that already exist. Obviously, there are no studies that have been done about that particular point because there isn't an international crime of ecocide, so there's no evidence to look at there yet. Another point that's been made here is, I think probably actually the strongest one, that by creating a crime of ecocide and enshrining it in international criminal law, you show just how serious this behaviour is, seriously wrong, in fact. That you show it's as bad as, say, genocide by enshrining it into international criminal law, and then people arguably will change their attitudes and perceptions in response to the change in the law. Now, in terms of whether you can get people to actually change their perceptions and more assumptions through change the legislation, that's actually something I'll look at when I look at the cons here. So you've heard the arguments in favour of the creation, or some of the arguments in favour of the creation of an international crime of ecocide. In terms of cons, there's the usual argument that I mentioned earlier that creating a new offence might unduly limit economic development. There have been quite a few studies done about that and whether environmental law does actually damage economies, if you can put it like that. Many people would say, well, even if it does, it's still justifiable because the cost is worth the benefit. But when you actually look at some of these studies on the economics, they actually, many of them suggest that there isn't actually the harm to the economy that you would expect. What you have, the argument goes, is people moving from, or companies moving from polluting harmful practices towards cleaner, more environmentally friendly practices. And obviously, certain industries, like maybe coal mining, will be damaged, but the jobs will shift to other industries. That's what some of the studies suggest anyway. Now, another argument is that, which is an argument used in relation to international law generally, is that international law is or can be an undesirable threat to national sovereignty. Basically, some politicians, for example, in say Brazil, to pick an example that has been in the news quite a few times over the recent years, will argue that it's not appropriate for the international community to tell them how to run things in their own country. So the international community will say, the Amazon forest is the lungs of the world, and therefore the world has a right to say how things are done there. But the Brazilian president has made the point that it's part of Brazil, and he's stated that international law should not be telling Brazil how to deal with the rainforest. This argument about international law, I think, can be raised in relation to any aspect of international law. It is an interference with autonomy. The question for me is whether it's a justifiable interference. All international law interferes with the way things are run in countries. That's the point of it. So I don't think that's necessarily a good argument. It is an interference with national sovereignty, but doesn't necessarily mean it's an inappropriate interference. Now, the next point here that you see about the International Criminal Court is, I think, quite specific to the International Criminal Court, but since there have been proposals that the International Criminal Court should be the one that deals with a crime of ecocide, there have been criticisms of the International Criminal Court which could undermine proposals to introduce this international crime of ecocide. So the International Criminal Court's been criticised for perceived lack of due process, and some of its judges have been said to be unsuitable. It is true, in fact, that some of it, at least one of its judges, has had no legal qualifications at all, and I could see why people would criticise that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there should be no crime of ecocide. You could argue it just means that the way judges are appointed to the International Criminal Court should be improved. It's not, I would say that's not an inherent criticism of any crime of ecocide. And the last point I want to look at here is that there's an argument that the International Criminal Court is not supposed to kind of lead the way and act unilaterally. It's supposed to complement domestic law. In fact, that's what it says in the statute that created the International Criminal Law, is there to complement domestic law and not act in lieu of it. Now, again, I would say that point is quite specific about the International Criminal Court. You could argue that if some domestic jurisdictions are not going to deal appropriately with large-scale destruction of the environment, then international law should lead the way, whether it be via the International Criminal Court or some other court that could be created to deal with this. So I think that's everything I wanted to say about international criminal law, and so I'll hand over to my co-presenter.
Jesse already took you through the benefits of criminalisation of ecocide, or to some extent anything else, at the international level. And of course, many of those will also apply to criminalising at the local level. So if we criminalised ecocide country by country using domestic law, national law, then we might deter harmful behaviour, stimulate innovation and development, and shift perceptions, change attitudes. Now, certainly some of that is correct. The threat of prison for individuals might focus corporate minds a great deal on compliance, and criminalisation has proved itself to be the cheapest method of changing behaviour. It's not most effective, but it is the cheapest, because all you have to do is slap it in a statute book. You don't have to then do anything about it because you hope people will comply. As Jesse said, there isn't a huge amount of evidence about whether people would comply with this crime as well as any other crime. But some countries have criminalised, as we'll see, and it does at least get things off the ground with prosecutions, but cliffhanger. Doesn't always finish them. So on the pro side, we might not need to prosecute people if we create an effective crime with a real threat in it. So heavy sanction, and not just fines, but individual criminal responsibility for people who have nice lives and don't want to lose them. Nice, comfortable life. Then you've got international law is not known for its speed in creation, amendment, or implementation. Whereas some countries, particularly little tiny island ones, can create law extremely fast. And for example, Jersey. It's a small unicameral jurisdiction. Don't have a second chamber required to pass laws, just one. So if you get a majority of them to agree with you, you can change the law today. Go far, far north to Guernsey. They have, that Northern Isle, local joke, they have a history of simply declaring the law to have changed. For example, there's a Guernsey case called Morton and Paint, where, with a completely straight face, the court declared that Guernsey had customary law which happened to be identical to the English Occupiers Liability Act 1957. Word by word identical. So they didn't have to pass a Guernsey piece of legislation, they just cut and pasted it into customary law. Now, many of you do customary law. Would you agree customary law does not do that? The clue is in the name. It's not appropriate somebody else's law without bothering to debate it in a legislature. But, you know, Guernsey's done that a few times. They could change the law, and technically Jersey could change the law overnight, which is an awful lot quicker than some jurisdictions could manage to do so. So speed and consensus are more likely, nation by nation, jurisdiction by jurisdiction. So if criminalising at the domestic level works, it does have some advantages. We have, however, whatever I do, we end up with a longer list of cons. It's just the nature of being a lawyer, I think, and trying to reform things. Now, people have been creating crimes of ecocide by name or by nature since 1990. And there have been very few successful prosecutions. So there have been prosecutions in almost every country which has introduced a crime of ecocide, but not a lot of convictions. And at the national level, there are some very big, powerful players in there who can work very hard to skew justice or to influence the results. And those national interests contribute to economies. They hold a lot of people's jobs in their hands, or the threat of entire industries disappearing. And so they can exert pressures. They also, of course, if you have a domestic crime with the burden of proof on the prosecution, you only need reasonable doubt about guilt, and the individual who caused the harm walks away. So when you criminalise, the stakes are very high, and it's an unequal, not a level playing field. You've got usually going to have big business against someone who wants them prosecuted. And the big business will have the evidence. So let's have a look at a couple of examples. Vietnam criminalised ecocide in 1990, very hefty sanctions on it, has tried prosecutions. The sanctions ranged originally from 10 years up to 10 years in prison up to capital punishment. So if that, you know, if anything's going to be a deterrent, I think that would be one, you know. And they have had prosecutions that fell apart. We'll see why in a moment. After the fall of the Soviet Union, lots of Eastern European states, including Russia, criminalised ecocide. And again, they have prosecuted, they have extremely hefty sanctions, and the prosecutions fall apart. Ecuador, Guatemala, laws against ecocide, and prosecutions have included some tragedies. So let's have a look at the majority failing, some examples of why. Sometimes the charges have fallen apart I'm trying not to name particular countries here for a very good reason. Sometimes, but I'll be less discreet later, off camera. Sometimes the charges have fallen apart because who controls the evidence in a criminal prosecution about the liability of the head of a company or decision makers in a multinational company? It's the lawyers in that company who will use everything they've got to make sure there isn't evidence. And what we're actually encouraging here, if we don't do anything to redress the power imbalance, we're encouraging missing evidence. We're encouraging non-transparent record keeping in the first place, because if there are no records of who made a decision, you've got nobody to prosecute. And most multinationals are quite happy to pay a fine if it means they can carry on doing the same thing. You know, it's a tax. It's just a tax called a criminal law sanction. Guatemala's environmental court would be brilliant, but somebody was murdered when they participated in the prosecution of a crime there, and other activists were threatened, intimidated, harassed. Power imbalance. You have to take a lot of steps to make sure that witnesses and victims can fight back and aren't threatened in the first place. It's a really easy way to make a crime go away, crime charge go away, is to attack the witnesses. So other crimes were committed in order to prevent liability for the crime of ecocide. And that it's not a very good balance. We then get ecocide tourism. So large multinationals can simply avoid jurisdictions which introduce a crime and end up with ecocide havens. So jurisdictions which have, in general, a relaxed approach to environmental regulation and also don't have a crime of ecocide, have a possibility over the next couple of decades of becoming ecocide havens as well as tax havens. And for the avoidance of doubt, the Channel Islands are not a tax haven by the legal definition of such. But this is a real possibility, and it worries me because if you're doing business in a small economy and you are a big, powerful international player, what are you going to do if they criminalise something you like doing? You think, oh, there's other islands. There's other places. So you have to build that into the plan. And one thing that some countries are really bad at is planning before making a decision, planning before changing law. And a lot of smaller jurisdictions or poorer jurisdictions tend to use the blind cut and paste method of legislation. So they find one that someone made earlier and they copy it and they see whether it works. Sometimes the results are comical, like when they don't actually have the people named in the law that they've copied because they don't exist. You know, chief constables or commissioners of things don't exist in the jurisdiction that's borrowed it from somewhere else. Sometimes the laws it needs to work don't exist. That's why you have to go in eyes open and tailor a response to your own jurisdiction, but build in the discussion about everybody's rights and needs and risks to the earliest stage of planning. Not do it as a bolt-on, box-ticking exercise at the very end, which is what small, cash-poor jurisdictions tend to do with law reform. And then we've got an often voiced, but as Jessie said, not a lot of evidence, not a lot of convincing evidence yet, concern that any country which goes as far as not only criminalising ecocide, but prosecuting people for it, may unduly limit their economic development. In other words, they will miss out on big players moving to them because of comparative advantage, disadvantage, or they will lose existing industries on which jobs, livelihoods depend. So, should Jersey do this, and how? Now, today we can only really start the debate on this, but it's going to be picked up in lots of other people's talks and probably in a bar somewhere near us. And for those of you who would have to join us remotely, we can figure something out, you know. Small jurisdictions can act very quickly and lead the way by example. Scotland's on the case. Scotland wants to lead in international law. It is much slower to legislate in Scotland than it is in Jersey. Or Guernsey, you don't even bother to legislate sometimes, you just declare. The declaratory method of law reform. So it's often said in small jurisdictions that because of this advantage of not having really complicated processes for drafting and amending laws, they could lead the way, they could get a shinier reputation in the world and a more leading position in the world by pen work, not money. So it's a cheap way of PR, essentially, for little places like Jersey. It's also something that Jersey needs. And yes, creating a domestic crime, so a crime that only applies within our territorial borders, and for people who choose to go to them, companies who, and individuals who choose to go to them, it could draw attention. But second point there is, nobody might know. Decades of being from Jersey and discussing law with people who are not from Jersey has made it incredibly obvious to me that the reaction will always be, the facial expression that I will always get when I explain some fundamental things about Jersey law is, huh? You know, people don't know. People in Jersey don't know. Nobody before me wrote down what the crimes are in Jersey comprehensively. First person to do it, 2017. You know, it's quite late when you're putting people in prison for crimes and you don't have a definition of them that's clear yet, and you don't know what the defences are either. You know, it's not great for giving legal advice, I would suggest. But, you know, how would anyone find out if Jersey criminalised ecocide? We would have to do a concerted effort to publicise the creation of the offence, and then to explain what individual criminal liability means with a penalty, a sanction, which is not money. Yeah, it is lamoy. It is prison. Don't have the death penalty, but, you know, prison, no more golf, that sort of thing. But after that, we would then have to, if you want a deterrent effect, you have to actually imprison some people. And before we can really do that, we have the third point here. If we want to trailblaze and do the right thing when it comes to the environment in a beautiful little island with some unique species and an awful lot of risks to them, we need to sort out the fact that the existing laws protecting the environment in Jersey are not comprehensive, they're not consistently enforced, and they're not up to date. So we might need to do a quick catch-up exercise, a piece of desktop research where we play snap with other jurisdictions in the world about what we've signed up to, what we've forgotten to sign up to, and what we've signed up to and done nothing about. We might also want to move some of our laws from the 90s to this century. And then there will be enough publicity within Jersey itself to be able to see that the reality of criminalisation for environmental crimes is there. Because at the moment, I don't think that's there. I don't think there's any cultural acceptance that something would be done to an individual, to a wealthy, powerful individual who polluted or wiped out wildlife. You know, it doesn't seem credible because there isn't the history of prosecutions and there isn't the publicity. And there's nobody putting it in the Daily Mail or any other British newspaper, which is read more often than the local newspapers by people in Jersey. So there are going to be, you know, if we want to change attitudes and behaviours, we need to tidy up the law first, enforce it, and then take it further. Now, this doesn't have to take a long time. We could tell Guernsey to do it, and they could do it by Wednesday, you know. And then we could say what they did, we'll do that. Or we could do it here in 1 year, I reckon. It could be done in 1 year. You could tidy up the law because there are experts who will do this. And it's the internet age. And some of them even work for free because it's research, you know. Could be done in a year. We could bring the law up to date. We could create a clear message that it will be enforced. Trickier bit is finding someone to prosecute. I'd leave that to someone, you know, who isn't supposed to be independent, like me, in multiple ways. Not a prosecutor yet, never been one yet. And we could then slap on top a tailored, carefully considered ecocide crime, which fits small jurisdictions. Once we've got that for small island jurisdictions, I've got another 80 plus of them in one of my networks who would really like to cut and paste it, and it would work because they've got the same concerns we have, relying on one or two industries who are powerful and linked to multinationals in order to survive and have a workforce is a very common small island jurisdiction thing. But when you put 80 plus of those together, it's a lot of people. And some of them are very powerful, and a lot of very rich people's bank accounts and tax write-offs live in those jurisdictions. So there is the possibility of real change. Now, over the rest of today and tomorrow, we're going to see lots of examples of issues that are specific to Jersey. I'm not proposing that every time someone puts rat poison down, because granite cottages and rats are kind of symbiotic, you know. Every time someone puts rat poison down, they are guilty of a crime of endangering Jersey bank rolls. They probably are, you know. But we're not looking at that level. We're going top, we're going things which are already crimes, but which aren't generally enforced and which need rebranding, remarketing for the 21st century so that you can get a movement behind it internationally to get small jurisdictions to lead the way, not one by one, but together. So my answer is we need Ecocide both at the national level and the international level. Who does it first doesn't necessarily matter, but you've got to actually prosecute people or the thing won't work.